questions. Now, the reality is that the 4 questions are there in order to have questions. The child we read last week in the Torah, yesterday we read in the Torah, the selection that we read was that the child shall ask you and you shall answer. And the 4 different questioning children become the source of what we call the 4 sons, the 4 children. But the model of children asking is seen as being central to the conveyance of the Passover story and of bringing home the idea from the Torah's point of view, how the rabbis understood it as well. I'm going to try to change the view. It's distracting for me. No, I don't know why it's like this. Very distracting for me. Okay. Either way, my screen is moving. I don't know. All right. So the idea of the 4 questions is that there be questions. And we can ask ourselves, why is it that the Torah, that God in the Torah wants there to be questions? So one approach is that you learn best when you ask questions. If I have skin in the game and I have vested, I want to be answered. So there's no question in the classroom that the person paying most attention to what the teacher is saying is the kid who asked the question. All right, the kid may be enjoying the glow of the attention, but also they're vested in it. Is it a good answer? It's not a good answer. So there is that element. We want engagement. And in general, for Jewish people, the idea of having questions is seen as a positive thing. Now, in the questioning, of course, going back to Mount Sinai, we find the Jewish people first said, we will do, we will obey, and then we will listen, which was understood as
Rabbi,
yes.
It's not necessarily a glow. It could be a glow from somebody asking a question, or it could feel like an obligation to ask because they truly don't understand, or they're checking their own. It's not necessarily a glow. I understand that it could be that, but it could be many different reasons.
Right. I'm just saying the reason for the vested element a child has when they ask a question is A, I have the question. B, I want to know.
A legitimate question.
Right, but you're vested then. You're vested. It's my question. It's a good thing. It's not a negative thing. And also,
I know Rich told me when he met me, a friend of his said that he never, and this is when I was 17, that he never heard somebody ask as many questions in his whole life as I asked. But they're real questions.
Right. So, so but the idea that a question helps you learn because you're analyzing, analytical. So it's true that when it comes to accepting the Torah, we say na'aseh v'nishma. We will do, and then we will study, we will obey, and then we will learn. There is that concept. There's no question obedience in observance is seen as an ideal. But what comes afterwards is for sure we should be analyzing and asking, but not in a way of rejection. If we don't understand, we say that our mind is limited and we want to understand. As a matter of fact, there's even an expression in the Talmud when a child asks a teacher, he should do so with respect. He should say, Rebbe, it's Torah and I have to learn. So please enlighten me, help me understand. So, but here in the Manish Tana, we find in the Talmud that when children ask the question at the Seder, not the formulated question that we all know and love, the Manish Tana, they said, oh, that's enough. As a matter of fact, what we're going to discover today, there were different versions of the Manish Tana. There were versions of 3 questions, of 4 questions, of 5 questions, even some of 2. They may have been scribal mistakes, but the point is there were different versions of questions. And one of the reasons why there were different versions, because it didn't matter what the questions were. On this level, as long as the child asked a question, it was great. The Manish Tana was to teach a child how to ask a question. It was to train the child too young to have that ability to formulate a question, or maybe not as interested, that here's a question for you. Ask this one. In other words, the Manish Tana was a formulated question. And what I was saying is that originally, it wasn't so formalized. It was suggestions of questions. And therefore, some versions had 3, some had 4, some had 5. But at a certain point, in order to make one universal custom, they were all merged together. And they ended up being 4 or even 5 questions at one period, as we'll see in a minute. But they all become formalized at a certain time. And the reason for this we find with other customs in Judaism. The Torah tells us to sound the shofar. It says to sound a truah, a broken blast. And we understand from the Jubilee year and from other sources that every broken blast has to be bracketed by 2 long blasts. Tekiah, followed by a broken blast, followed by a tekiah. The debate among the sages was, what is called a broken blast? Some people went, others went, others went both together. So which one is the way that we do it? We do all 3. We do 30 blasts of the shofar because we're doing all 3 versions. We are doing 10 blasts of each type. So, or 9 of some. But the point, though, is that in order to create a universal custom among the Jewish people, they merged and came up with a version where they included all the different types of blasts. The short blast, the tiny blast, the combination blast, all bracketed by the regular ones. The shofar calls that weren't always done that way. Some synagogues blew it one way, others another. But already in the Talmudic period, they made one universal custom. Something similar happens in our prayer books at times. And here in the Haggadah, that's what happened with the Manish Tana. So we're going to look at so I want to set that up first. The Manish Tana did exist in different ways, 3, 4, and 5. We're going to look at some of those questions and try to understand how they evolved and what the meaning is for us. So first of all, the first big question is, let's look at the Manish Tana and see how we see what their question is and what the answer is. So I'm looking for my okay. So this is an English Haggadah, and we will go to the telling of the story. So what happens is we begin the Seder with, this is the bread of affliction. We uncover the matzah a little bit. And then we fill up the second cup. This is after we make Kiddush, and the child asks the questions. Ma nishtana. What makes this night different from all other nights? Or in what way is this night different? So then it seems the child's asking, on all other nights, we don't dip even once. Tonight, we do twice. On all other nights, we eat chametz or matzah. On this night, only matzah. And all other nights, we eat any kind of vegetable. Tonight, maror. And all other nights, we eat sitting upright or reclining. And tonight, we all recline. And when the temple was still in existence, they would say, on all other nights, we eat cooked meat, boiled meat, roasted meat, and tonight we eat roasted meat. In other words, that was the question connected to the Paschal Lamb. So on a very simple level, what is the answer to these questions? The kid asks the question, and then we go into the Haggadah. We don't seem to answer the questions right away. We say we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out. And then we speak about the sages that happened, the Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Tarfon, and we go off on this tangent. And then we speak of the 4 sons. What's the answer? So one classical approach is we have to understand what the question is. The question is really one question. What makes this night different? Why? What's the problem? Why is the child asking the question? The child is bothered by we're doing seemingly diametrically opposed rituals on this night. On one hand, we're acting like free people celebrating. On the other hand, we're remembering slavery. We're eating bitter herbs, we're eating the flat matzah, but we're reclining and we're dipping, we're drinking wine, but there's elements which seem to be all about luxury and freedom and celebration, and others about mourning and about oppression, about slavery. That's the question. Why are we celebrating both? The child knows Sukkot is all happy, Purim is all happy, Hanukkah is all happy, Tisha B'Av is all sad. What is this with this type of switching? This type of back and forth, make up your mind. So we answer the child according to this approach. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out with a strong arm. What is happening here? We're explaining the schizophrenia in our behavior. We're saying, you know why we're celebrating both? You know why we celebrate freedom and slavery? Because we experienced both. And the whole point of celebrating leaving Egypt is to visualize as if you left Egypt this moment. That's part of the mitzvah, as we're going to see, that you have to view yourself as having been taken out by God from Egypt and sing songs of praise for that. And thank you, God, for saving me. The only way you can do that is if you first focus on the oppression. And only then can you focus on the redemption. So tonight we focus on both elements. And a matter of fact, if you divided every single symbol of our Seder, it can express both suffering and it can also express in the very same object, it can also express freedom. Some of them are more leaning towards the freedom and some more to the servitude. So for example, the wine in our cup is celebration, but the custom is to try to get red wine to remember our blood that was spilled. The salt water reminds us of tears, but it could also be the splitting of the sea. The matzah is poor man's bread, but it's also the bread that we wore on our backs when we left Egypt, and that we left with faith and we trusted in God, and it represents redemption. The matzah itself we break in half, symbolizing these two elements, slavery and freedom. And even in freedom itself, like we touched on last night, every element of freedom can be divided into two in the whole Seder. Freedom from the past, of slavery of previous exiles, and freedom in the future with Mashiach. In other words, the dual symbolism of suffering and freedom, and even the suffering that we're in now and the future freedom, is without question a theme throughout the Seder. And the way we answer why do we commemorate both is because that is the message of Passover. You were slaves and God took us out. We're commemorating both slavery and freedom. That's a classical approach, but it's a little more interpretive than literal. What do I mean? We forget the Seder, the Haggadah expanded. And because it expanded, we sometimes lose the connection between different segments of the Haggadah. So the Haggadah, as we touched on the first night, the primary elements were a question, whatever that question is. Tell the child or say that you were slaves and God took us out. We were idol worshipers and God drew us near. Interpret the biblical verses of the first fruits. And then we come to the next ingredient, which is Rabban Gamliel. What did Rabban Gamliel say? Right here is Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel says, he uses the same words as the Ma'anesh Tana. And imagine a long excursion, like a rabbi giving a sermon, or in the Talmud, a student would ask a question and they would go off on all sorts of tangents and come back and tie the loose ends together. In a similar fashion, each one of us is engaged in this type of analytical study. Every child is being trained to be a rabbinic scholar, a scholar of Torah, an ability to read every word as having layers of meaning. So what happens? Rabbi Gamliel says like this, and you'll see how it fits right into the Manish Tana. Rabbi Gamliel used to say, whoever does not discuss the following three things has not fulfilled his obligation. What are they? Passover, the paschal sacrifice, matzah, the unleavened bread, and maror, the bitter herbs. Passover, this Passover lamb that our forefathers ate when the Beit HaMikdash was in existence. Why did they do it? Because God passed over their homes in Egypt, like it says. You shall say it's a Pesach offering to the Lord, because he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians with a plague and he saved our houses. And the people bowed and prostrated themselves. This is a quote from Exodus. It's the wicked son's answer, by the way, but it's here as a central part, as understanding for each one of us why we eat the Paschal lamb, and that we're supposed to say this. Why do we eat the matzah? Why do we eat it? Ma, al shum ma, the same words as Manish Tana. Manish Tana laila zeh, Pesach zeh shanochum al shum ma. Same word, ma, what? This matzah that we eat, what's the reason? Because the dough of our forefathers did not have time to rise before God revealed himself and redeemed them. Like it says, they baked matzahs out of the dough. They've been driven out of Egypt, and they could not delay, and they're not provided any of the provisions. Then we take the maror. This maror that we eat, why do we eat it? Because they embittered our lives. In other words, we are saying the reason why we keep these rituals, God commanded us in order to remember Egypt. If it's in order to remember Egypt, you better express it, or you're not really doing the job so well. Because you should express it and testify to it and elaborate on why we're doing this. Because if the point of the ritual is explicit in the text, according to this rabbi, it's explicit that you should know the reason why you're eating it, because God skipped over the homes, Paschal lamb, because the matzah, because you didn't have time to rise, because you left with faith. The maror, because you're busy. You have to think of it. You have to say it. You have to explain it. Now, one can argue that some of the versions of the original 4 questions were 3 questions. Which 3? Paschal lamb, matzah, and maror. Why? Because it was all designed to be like Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel, already before the Manish Tana is formulated, Rabbi Gamliel's themes are already there as having to be explained. So you pick questions that you're going to explain explicitly. Now, so I just want to clarify this. I want to open this up so everyone understands. This interpretation is saying the Manish Tana is designed to overlay Rabbi Gamliel. It is the question for Rabbi Gamliel. As a matter of fact, I want to do one more paragraph that comes in the Mishnah right after Rabbi Gamliel. It says, in every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself as if he had come out of Egypt. Like it says, you shall tell your child on that day, it is because of this that the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. Like we tell, this Bavor Zeh we also use in the 4 sons. But the point though here is that to view yourself as if you left Egypt, that explains some of the other themes, that you're reclining, that you're leaning, or even all these rituals are related to that theme, that you are acting in a way as if you had gone out of Egypt. That's the whole point of the Seder. But it also answers all the questions the child might have, including dipping and leaning. So I want to go back. The original questions, according to this interpretation, were 3. Paschal lamb, matzah, and maror, which fit exactly with Rabbi Gamliel. However, the truth is We do find other old versions, manuscripts from the Talmudic period, a little bit after the Talmudic period, it seems, that had within, they had the questions that they had were not the murrah, but the dipping that they dipped twice. So the simple thing is that what they were dipping primarily was murrah. That was the big deal. They were dipping this murrah into the charoses. So either way, the dipping was also related to the murrah question. So just to resolve what the Manishtana is designed to do on the most basic level is a child should ask a question. The formalized version was about the things that it asks the things that you have to express, which was Paschal Lamb, Matzah, Murrah, and visualizing and acting and seeing yourself as if you left Egypt. So let me open up for questions a little bit, and then we'll come back and do a little more about some of these themes. So any thoughts or questions anyone want to interject? If not, I'll jump right back in. Okay, I'm going to jump back in to the Manishtana for a second. So going back to the Manishtana, the Rebbe asks an interesting question. The order of the Manishtana, you may have realized, is slightly different in different Haggadahs. In our Haggadah, first comes the dipping, then the matzah, then the murrah, and then the sitting and reclining. So the order in other people's Haggadah is matzah, murrah, dipping, then reclining. But what's interesting, in the oldest versions, it's more like this, like we have here. But there were different reasons why it got changed around. Once you were no longer doing the Paschal sacrifice, that also moves things around a little bit in the questioning. But the Rebbe points out a beautiful thing. The Rebbe says that we have here in this Manishtana, we have things that are customs, and we have things that are rabbinic law, and we have things that are biblical law, and there are things that are like supporting biblical law. So for example, biblical law is to eat matzah. The mitzvah to eat maror was only when you had a Paschal lamb. So nowadays, we consider that to be rabbinic, to eat maror. The rabbis instituted that even today, after the destruction of the temple, we should continue to eat the bitter herbs, even though we don't have a Paschal lamb to have it with. Then you have the leaning, the reclining, which is part and parcel of the rabbinic law about how you should eat on this night. Then you have the dipping. The dipping for us has become the first one. We dip the root vegetable in salt water. That has become a custom. In the ancient Greek world, that might have been the norm before you began a meal, to have a little bit of vegetables or lettuce or something, bitter herb. For them, it was lettuce into the salt water, into vinegar, into something. But it became in later years a custom. And why do we do it? Because even though we don't eat like that anymore, they wanted to do something different, that the children should ask questions. Do something strange. As a matter of fact, there are different customs associated with stimulating the child's attention. So for example, stealing the afikomen. Stealing the afikomen was designed to keep the kids awake. It's exciting. Or hiding the afikomen. In Chabad, they didn't like the idea of stealing the afikomen because they didn't want to train children to steal, even for fun. Even for fun, it's not the best custom. But many people would hide the afikomen, the children would try to find it. And it's all based on a quote that says, you grab the matzah so the kids don't fall asleep. This is a quote in the Talmud. And the different interpreters debate what that means. Some say it means you eat quickly so the kids are able to get the whole Seder in. Others say, no, it means this idea of grabbing the matzah one from the other one hand from the other in order that the kids should be excited by the grown-ups, grabbing the matzah. But either way, what happens is that you have customs that are designed to keep the kids awake. Like all the songs at the end of the Seder are not integral to the Passover story. They come at the conclusion of the Seder. They're just to keep the kids up, to have a nice kumsitz, that the kids should be excited to sing together with everybody. This was entertainment before TV and phones. The family would sing together. So they took these beautiful songs of Passover and they put them at the end. And this way it's a motivation to keep the kids awake. So there are all sorts of customs to keep the kids awake. And one of them, or to ask questions. We do this dipping ritual. We wash our hands. We don't make a blessing. Normally, the only time we wash our hands nowadays is before we eat matzah or bread. But here, before we dip the vegetable in salt water, we also wash our hands, although without a blessing. Why? So the way it's understood today, although it may have holdovers from earlier rituals, it's just being done to let the children ask questions. So the Rebbe says, we can see from this a very powerful thing, that sometimes what resonates with a child more than a biblical law or rabbinic law are the customs of Judaism. Getting dressed up on Purim, it's a custom. Eating hamantash is a custom. Wearing a kippah is a custom. There are things that make us different from our neighbors that are exciting or fun, or not even just exciting or fun. They stand out. So a custom has that ability to grab our eye. And the Rebbe says that we shouldn't dismiss the customs, God forbid, the customs of our families, the customs of our communities, and for sure the customs of the Jewish people as a whole. That we should be able to appreciate their uniqueness that they are giving to us, to our Jewish identity. There's another theme, which I just want to touch on because it's related to this, about the value of custom. And so the Rebbe is explaining why the dipping comes first nowadays in our customs and how we're doing things. But the Rebbe says there's an interesting concept. If someone comes home and says to his spouse or her spouse, can I get a cup of tea? I'm so thirsty. And the spouse brings a cup of tea. Or you come home and you go, oi, and your partner knows you want a cup of tea. Or you walk in the door, before you say anything, they know you so well they have a cup of tea for you. Which is a greater expression of the closeness and love? The one that intuits what you want, even though you didn't ask for it. So the Rebbe said this is the deeper Hasidic understanding of the difference between biblical law, rabbinic law, and custom. A biblical law is like you say to your kid, get me a cup of tea, please. God's commanding it. A rabbinic law is alluded to. It's like you go, oi, and they bring you a cup of tea. A custom is us reading the mind of God. A custom is an expression that Jews pick, a dancing with the Torah on Simchas Torah. It's not commanded anywhere. It's a Jewish custom about our love of the Torah, a love of God, a love of the gift he gave us, a love of the bond. We rejoice, we sing, we're happy. It's not a biblical law. It's not a rabbinic law. It's a custom. So customs are this unique ability to be able to reach the depth of our soul, because paradoxically, when we're not commanded, there's an element there of a free will offering. It's our own desire to connect to Hashem that we come up with these different rituals, these different ideas, to be able to express it.
Rabbi,
yes.
the idea though of dancing, and it's very interesting what you're saying. It's like how it how it impresses upon a child. Because I remember me growing up with my grandpa and the Seder, and how the family gathered and everything. Compared to my kids growing up, it's not the same. like, but the dancing with the Torah, I mean, that is biblical anyway. Like with David, when aren't they dancing and singing and
Right,
celebrating?
but that's any day, that's when they brought the David, it wasn't a commandment. It was
Right,
David
okay.
doing it on his own, but you're right. And he was somersaulting and he was doing all sorts of things in front of the Torah. And his wife was not happy with it, but that was the right thing to do. But this is a holiday that's chosen, that Jews go around 7 times the circuit, the whole ritualized nature of it, not just the passion, the flag,
Okay.
and not just that, a special day we choose to begin the Torah anew and to end it. All that is not even rabbinic. It's ancient Jewish customs to pick a day and finish the Torah on that day. So going back to this idea about the value of customs, is that these are things that resonate at times with us more. And the Seder is full of mitzvahs, laws, biblical, rabbinic, and customs too. So, but just the folk ways can sometimes be dismissed. Okay, that's one interpretation about the order of it. There's another idea that the custom is that even if you have a child asking the 4 questions, each participant also asks the 4 questions. And in Yiddish, the questions would begin, Father, I want to ask you 4 questions. The first question is, why is this from us? Is the Nachman Pesach? Why is that Pesach? Different from all, and we translate the Hebrew into Yiddish, and we say, and we conclude with God, I've asked you to, we say, Father, I've asked you the 4 questions, now please give me an answer. So the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe said that the 4 questions can be seen as being asked of God as well. God Almighty, why is this night, this exile, different than all the other exiles? And all the other exiles, you don't even dip once. Now we're being dipped twice, whether into, terrible things. The murder, the matzah, we're leaning, we're not even standing up. God, we want the redemption. Send us the redemption. So here you have an example of a reinterpretation of the Manishtana out of its literal context, but to fit with the general yearning we discussed last night for Mashiach being implicit in the whole Seder. So wherever you dig in the Seder, you'll find Mashiach. Why? We're celebrating freedom. We look forward to a future redemption. As a matter of fact, it's a little bit ironic that we're even celebrating freedom, God forbid, if we're in the Gulag or in a concentration camp. How do we celebrate freedom? The only way we celebrate freedom is because we say, God, you redeemed us once, you'll redeem us again, and I'm going to act right now as if I was fully redeemed. And Jews in the Gulag, Jews in the concentration camp, kept the Seder. How? Because they saw and they visualized the future, and they saw and they visualized the past. And I have to tell you, the symbol of a child asking the adult is the symbol of the two-faced, two-directional facing Jew. We look to the past and we look to the future. The child is optimistic, looking forward to the future. The person who's already older is looking back at the golden past. In Judaism, we want both. We want to have the child and the adult. And this is the dance of the Passover Seder, the interaction of the younger and older generations. The parents, like Karen just said, oh, I remember my parents' Seder, my grandparents. That's a sense of memory, looking back. And then you have a sense of future. What does it mean to me? What did it mean to them? What does it mean to me? So this is just another great example of where commentators, it's not literal, took the Manishtana and make it into a plea to God that please give me an answer. The answer is redemption. What's the question? Exile. This is also one of the reasons why we begin. The Seder is a very strange beginning. I'll get back to the Manishtana, but at the strange beginning that we say, this is the bread of affliction our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, come and eat. Whoever is in need, come and conduct the Seder. Now we are here, next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year free people. So there's lots of questions about this paragraph. But one of the elements is, what are we starting with here? We're slaves. Because if you're sitting down with the Seder at some point in the last 2,000 years after the destruction, the question that has to be asked in the back of your mind is, we're suffering. We're in exile. There are oppressors. We're being beaten up. We're being killed. We're being tortured for your sake, oh God. But enough already. We're in exile. How can we celebrate redemption? So we right away begin the Seder with, we were slaves and we were freed. I'm sorry. This year we are here, and next year in Israel. This year we're slaves, next year free people. Then right away we begin with that hope and expectancy, because that's the only way, so to speak, we can even get into the mode of the Seder if we're going through a very difficult time. All right, back to the 4 questions. So with the 4 questions, the question that's interesting about, I'm going to go to each one. The first question, on all other nights, we need not dip even once. And this night, we do so twice. In Hebrew, we say, we don't even have to dip once. Now we do twice. The reality is that originally, when you came into a meal in those days, as you walked in, they would give you vegetables to dip. So the first dipping was normal. It was the second dipping that caused questions, the middle of the meal, to dip again, because they were used to it. First, you enter into this foyer, and they give you all sorts of appetizers, vegetables. That's what they used to do, and then you sat down and you reclined. So the question, we changed the Manashtana, the version a little bit. Here's an important point. As customs changed, the Manashtana gets tweaked, and so do other parts of the Seder get tweaked so that they still make sense. For example, the Paschal Lamb, we don't eat nowadays after the destruction of the temple. So what do we say when we read Rabbi Gamliel? This Paschal Lamb that our forefathers used to eat, but the original version was this Paschal Lamb that we eat. If this was the Rabbi Gamliel who was in the time of the Second Temple period. And if you remember from our last year, there were a few Rabbi Gamliels, depending on which Rabbi Gamliel it was, depending on when he lived. The point, though, is the Manashtana, which asked the question about roast meat, got tweaked out. Why? We weren't eating roast meat anymore. As a matter of fact, Ashkenazic Jews don't eat roast meat on the night of the Seder because they don't want it to look like we're doing a sacrifice outside the temple. Sephardic Jews do eat roast meat. So when we eat brisket, we put with liquid. It's
I was going to ask.
Never just roasted whole, like or roasted over the fire. Liquid is fine.
Which Rabbi Gamliel? I didn't even know there were more than one.
Yeah, if you remember from the summertime, we had 3 Rabbi Gamliels. There were different periods. Grandchild, the 7 generations from Hillel all the way to Yehuda the Prince has 3 Rabbi Gamliels there. Anyway,
so which one are you referencing again?
Oh, so I'm saying it's not clear which one it was. Depending on which one it was, the Rabbi Gamliel of our Passover Seder, depending on when he lived. If he lived in the temple period, so then he would have said, this Paschal Lamb that we eat. If he was his grandson, he would say, this Paschal Lamb that we used to eat. I'm just bringing out the point that things get tweaked a little bit. Like the prayers that we would say when the Jerusalem was around and the temple, we weren't praying for the rebuilding. We would say God should support, God should uplift, God should keep peace. But we didn't say build. It's only when there was instruction we said rebuild. So prayers get tweaked. Prayers get tweaked, and the ritual get tweaked a little bit over time. So originally the dipping was everyone did once. So the question was, on all other nights we dip once. Why tonight twice? So then they switched it. And they said all other, because nowadays we don't dip before we eat in a normal breakfast, lunch, or supper. So we say we don't even have to dip once. Now we dip twice. Now the Matzah stayed the same. But on the maror, on the bitter herbs, right, was the one that it says on this night, maror, not just maror, we have other vegetables. So you see here a little bit of that element. One little thought about each one of us asking the Manishtana. The challenge for us is to be that questioning child, optimistic, open, enthusiastic, curious. This is what the Seder is trying to accomplish in us, to make the wide-eyed wonder part of our life, to get rid of the jaded nature. We are going to not be like the wicked son who says, what are you guys doing year after year, according to that reading that we read, but rather enthusiastic. It's new. It's a new thing. It's a new day, a new insight, a new beginning. We want to be like a child in that way. There's a famous story of a Hasidic Rebbe that was once having a gathering. I think it was the Belzer Rebbe, and everyone was enjoying the conversation, and they had run out of wine. So one of the Hasidim said to another, go get some more wine for the crowd. He said, no, I'm enjoying it. So the Rebbe says, I have a young boy outside. I'll have him go. So Rebbe goes and comes back 20 minutes later with the wine. And the student said, Rebbe, why did you go? And why did you lie to us? You said there's a young boy outside. He said, ever since I was a child and as I grew up, I made up my mind, I was never going to leave behind my inner child. I was going to always have it ready for the outside. Always be ready to engage in that. So my kid was still there. The Rebbe used to say, we don't judge age by a passport. That's not what age is. The Rebbe would say, I'm an old man, he told people, with young ideas. In other words, to be creative and to be enthusiastic and look for new ideas and look for new opportunities is the mark of a young person. And the Seder, we want both. We want that chain of tradition, but we want the freshness. Like we have the story, the elders sitting around telling the story, not just discussing the laws and analytics. They're telling the story all that night until their students come. So again, the Manishtana really personifies this idea of the youth within and the importance of questions and the importance of delving. And one element that we just touched on was that sometimes the answer could come a little bit longer in Jewish thought. It may take a while to get to the answer. With Gamliel, famous three elements are at the end of the Seder, the end of the Magid, this section. So I want to get to this idea in every generation one more time about visualizing oneself. One of the challenges is we say that, where is it? We say, if God had not taken us out, we would all still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Here, right in the beginning. We say we were slaves right here. Here. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. This is right after the Manishtana. And the Lord our God took us out with a strong hand with outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we and our children would have been enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. So, and no matter how wise we are, we self-discuss it. This idea that we would still be there, and you, our children, and your children would still be there, is to bring it home that this is, you were free. It wasn't just our forefathers. It was you. So now, the Hasidic interpretation of Egypt is a little more expansive than just a physical place, even more than just physical oppression. The Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, means boundaries or constraints, Meitzar Ugvul, which is constraints. And to leave Egypt is to leave your constraints. Every one of us has constraints on our good behavior, our moral behavior, and even in holy things. In other words, even in your righteousness, we have constraints. I give charity 10%. I could give 20. That's a limit. I am nice to people most of the time, but I'm not super nice to obnoxious people, right? There's always room. We all have our self-defined boundaries and limitations. Some are more explicit and some are more clear than others. And these boundaries are lorded over by a pharaoh. We have a pharaoh that sits at our neck and that we are enslaved to, so to speak. We're stuck. And what we say in Passover night is, God, remove the shackles. God, take off the limitations. Take me out of my personal Egypt. Remove my personal Pharaoh. If it takes, in a good way, the 10 plagues, each one is a transformative type of experience where we can break some of our negativity and achieve a level of freedom. So this visualization of leaving Egypt is truly a daily exercise, not just Passover. And a matter of fact, we mentioned, like we say in the Haggadah right here, that we mention leaving Egypt every day and every night. Passover, we speak about it at length because it's the source of it. But every day you have to open up the spigot. You got to take out a little bit of the life-giving, nurturing nature of the ability to leave our Egypt. What's my Egypt? I have a self-image of myself in a certain way, and that's in Egypt. To break free is to break that. I have a bad habit. That's in Egypt. Now, it's not like the high holidays where our buildup is very gradual. We start a month before doing introspection. Here, Passover, we say God reaches down, plucks us out, whether we're ready or not. And so therefore, it's a time that's open for us to make transformation. Like the word Paschal sacrifice, Pesach, means God jumped. So the jumping means that God skipped over our homes. That means the idea is we're given and we were taken out of Egypt, even though we hadn't fully repented, we weren't fully deserving. It says that the angels say to God, they're both idol worshipers, the Jews and the Egyptians. Why are you saving one and punishing the other? And the truth is that's in the book of Joshua explicitly. He says your forefathers worshipped idols. Now some say in our Haggadah, it means before they came to the land of Israel with Abram's parents. But you could read the biblical text as meaning in Egypt, the Jews were idol worshipers, or some of them, not the tribe of Levi, but others were. We weren't deserving. The only reason we came out is we kept the Paschal lamb, we were circumcised, and God takes us out. But the point is, every year anew, on Passover, we get the free ride home. God plucks us out of our exile, whether it's physical, which we pray for, Mashiach, or if it's a limited exile, we may be going through our own physical problems. We say on Passover, we have the ability to break free from our limitations, or it's our own spiritual exile, leaving our own little Egypt behind. So this idea of how do we visualize ourselves that we're leaving Egypt is to recognize that the physical Egypt was only part of the problem. There's a spiritual Egypt that we carry around with us. And every generation, we have to see ourselves as if we were taken out and try to act taking out.